Two guards have to drag the limp body across the dirt, assuming it is just another exhausted German soldier who collapsed during the long journey. But the heat radiating through the heavy wool uniform is unnatural, burning right through the fabric into the hands of the Americans holding the prisoner. When they lay the teenager on the intake cot, a young voice mutters something in German about a boiling brain, the eyes rolling back into a flushed, sweat-soaked face. The camp doctor takes one look, slides a glass thermometer under the tongue, and waits for the mercury to rise. When he pulls it out, the thin line reads 106 degrees, a number that means organs are already starting to cook inside the skull. The doctor grabs a pair of heavy shears to cut away the uniform, but what the open fabric reveals will completely paralyze the room. The scene begins in the final frantic months of the war, inside a massive prisoner of war intake camp run by the United States military. Trucks arrive daily, dumping thousands of captured German soldiers into holding pens where the dust never quite settles. One afternoon, a prisoner is pulled from the back of a truck, completely unresponsive and shivering violently despite the brutal heat of the day. The guards assume it is severe exhaustion, a common sight among men who have been marching for weeks with almost no rations. They drag the small, slight figure toward the medical tent, noticing only that the uniform hangs loosely on the frail frame. Every time the prisoner exhales, a dry, rattling moan escapes, carrying the distinct smell of severe dehydration and sickness. Inside the medical tent, the noise of the camp fades behind heavy canvas flaps, replaced by the low groans of the wounded and the sharp orders of the medical staff. A doctor orders the guards to place the new arrival on the nearest available canvas cot. The prisoner's skin is dark red, covered in a terrible rash of small, dark pink spots that spread across the neck and wrists. The doctor recognizes the spots immediately as the classic signature of epidemic typhus, a highly contagious and deeply feared killer. He slides a thermometer into the patient's mouth and watches the young face twist in a delirium of pain. The patient mutters a single clear phrase in German, complaining that their brain is boiling inside their skull. When the doctor checks the thermometer, the reading is a catastrophic 106 degrees, a fever that high requires immediate, drastic action, or the brain will suffer permanent, fatal damage within hours. He shouts for orderlies to bring ice and cold water from the mess hall kitchen immediately. Because the stiff, filthy wool uniform is trapping the lethal heat against the body, there is no time to unbutton it. The doctor grabs a pair of heavy medical shears and begins to cut the heavy gray fabric right down the center of the chest. What happens next forces every moving person in the tent to stop dead in their tracks. As the heavy wool tunic falls open, the doctor reaches to pull away the undershirt, but his hands freeze in midair. Beneath the military layers, the chest is tightly bound with strips of ragged cloth, completely changing the shape of the torso. The structure of the shoulders, the curve of the collarbone, and the frantic, half-conscious attempt of the patient to cover up reveal a truth nobody expected. The patient burning up with a lethal typhus infection is not a teenage boy. It is an 18-year-old girl who has been hiding her identity in plain sight among thousands of male prisoners. The medical staff stand in stunned silence, staring at an enemy combatant who breaks every rule of the camp's existence. United States camps are strictly segregated, and female combatants or prisoners are an extreme rarity, usually handled in entirely different facilities back in Europe. The doctor quickly pulls a sheet over her, his mind racing to understand how a girl managed to survive the front lines, the surrender, and the transport ships without being discovered. The immediate crisis, however, leaves no time for interrogations or military police reports. Typhus does not care about gender, and the bacteria multiplying in her blood is only hours away from shutting down her heart. We are currently in a United States camp hospital, staring at a girl dying of typhus inside a men's prison. Now, we go back a few months to the collapsing front lines in Europe to see how she ended up disguised as a soldier in the first place. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? If you want to dive even deeper into these untold stories, consider becoming a channel member. You'll get your name mentioned in the video, early access to videos, exclusive content, and direct input on which stories we cover next. Join our inner circle of history keepers. Months earlier, The girl, whose real name is Alara, was living in a German city that was slowly being erased by daily bombing raids. Like many young women at the end of the war, she was drafted into auxiliary roles, operating searchlights and clearing rubble, while the actual military crumbled around them. The nights were spent in damp cellars, listening to the ground shake and waiting for the sirens to finally stop. When the Eastern Front collapsed completely, absolute panic swept through her unit as stories of what happened to captured women reached their ears. Survival meant disappearing, but running as a civilian woman on roads choked with retreating armies and lawless militias made her an easy target. The military structure was dissolving into chaos, and officers were abandoning their posts to flee westward. Alara realized that staying in her auxiliary uniform or changing into civilian clothes would both mark her as vulnerable. She needed a way to become completely invisible in the sea of defeated, marching men. She watched columns of retreating soldiers pass by her ruined street, noticing how covered in mud, soot, and exhaustion they were. Nobody was looking at faces anymore. They were only looking at the ground in front of their boots. Chapter 4. The disguise. One night, while hiding in a ruined barn on the edge of the city, she found the answer to her terrible problem. Lying in the shadows was the body of a young soldier who had been killed by shrapnel days before. Desperation pushed her to do something unthinkable in peacetime, but entirely necessary for survival in a destroyed world. She stripped the oversized uniform from the boy, holding her breath against the smell of old blood and dirt. She then bound her chest tightly with torn bedsheets, flattening her silhouette as much as possible. She found a rusty knife in the barn and hacked away at her own hair until it was as short and uneven as a fresh recruit's. When she stepped out onto the road the next morning, she smeared her face and neck with mud and engine grease. She pulled the heavy wool cap down low over her eyes and hunched her shoulders to hide her slender frame. She was no longer a civilian girl running for her life. She was just another anonymous, defeated boy marching in the endless columns of the broken army. The disguise worked flawlessly precisely because the situation around her was so desperate. The retreating soldiers were starving, exhausted, and entirely focused on putting one foot in front of the other to escape the advancing artillery. Alara kept her head down, spoke as little as possible, and mimicked the rough, exhausted posture of the men beside her. She slept in ditches and abandoned cellars, terrified that if she fell into a deep sleep, someone would discover her secret. She avoided the latrines when others were around, risking punishment for wandering off just to maintain her hidden identity. The endless marching finally stopped when her disorganized column was entirely surrounded by advancing American forces. The German officers ordered a surrender, and Alara threw her rifle into a pile with hundreds of others, raising her hands in the cold air. The American soldiers who searched them were moving quickly, patting down the prisoners for weapons and pushing them into makeshift holding pens. Because she was wearing a thick winter coat and smelled just as terrible as the rest of the men, the guards pushed her through without a second glance. She had survived the battlefield, but the conditions inside the prisoner transport system were about to expose her to a new horror. The prisoners were packed into overcrowded boxcars for the long journey toward the permanent camps and eventually the ports. In the dark, freezing train cars, men were pressed shoulder to shoulder, unable to sit down or wash for days on end. It was in this suffocating environment that the real enemy began to spread quietly from uniform to uniform. Body lice, carrying the deadly typhus bacteria, thrived in the seams of the dirty wool clothing that the prisoners had worn for months. Because Alara was terrified of exposing her identity, she refused to take off her coat or shirt, even when the air in the boxcar grew stiflingly hot. Her absolute refusal to undress made her the perfect host for the parasites hiding in the borrowed fabric. A single bite from an infected louse was all it took to introduce the bacteria directly into her bloodstream. By the time the train reached the port and the prisoners were loaded onto a transport ship bound for the United States, the disease was already incubating inside her. She felt the first heavy wave of exhaustion while sitting in the dark hull of the ship, assuming it was simply seasickness and hunger. She did not know that her blood was turning into a battlefield. When the transport ship finally docks at an eastern port in the United States, Alara faces her most dangerous test yet. The standard procedure for all incoming prisoners of war is a complete strip search, and a mandatory chemical shower to kill parasites. Thousands of men are lined up on the concrete docks, forced to take off their filthy uniforms before being sprayed with harsh delousing powder. Ilara watches the lines moving forward, her heart hammering against her ribs in sheer terror. She knows that the moment she unbuttons her coat in front of the American guards, her disguise will instantly fail. Desperation forces her to make a risky move to avoid the stripping lines. By this time, the typhus bacteria has fully taken hold, and she is already running a dangerous fever, her skin pale and slick with sweat. Instead of moving forward with the healthy men, she intentionally collapses against a metal railing, letting her eyes roll back. An overwhelmed guard sees the shivering, unresponsive soldier and assumes it is just another case of extreme malnutrition and seasickness. To keep the processing lines moving, the guard bypasses the shower protocol and orders her carried directly onto the medical transport train heading inland. She narrowly escapes discovery, but by avoiding the chemical spray, she guarantees the typhus will continue to ravage her body unchecked. We are now on that medical transport train rolling toward the inland camp, with the invisible infection rapidly pushing her toward the boiling point. The long hours on the rail cars give the bacteria the perfect environment to multiply in her exhausted bloodstream. Next, we return to the camp hospital in America, where the train finally unloads its passengers, and the hidden crisis explodes into reality. Back in the medical tent at the camp, the discovery of Ilara's true identity creates an immediate logistical nightmare for the American staff. The doctor orders a small storage room at the back of the hospital to be cleared out and converted into a private isolation ward. This is done not just to quarantine the highly contagious typhus, but to protect the young girl from the thousands of male prisoners outside the canvas walls. Only the doctor and 2 trusted nurses are allowed inside the room, sworn to secrecy to prevent panic and confusion in the camp. They carefully strip away the rest of her infested clothing, sealing the dangerous wool in bags to be burned immediately. The reality of treating epidemic typhus in the 1940s is brutal, relying almost entirely on managing the symptoms until the fever breaks. The nurses pack ice around her neck, under her arms, and across her groin, trying to force the boiling temperature down. Ilara thrashes against the cot, her mind completely lost in a terrifying hallucination brought on by the massive thermal stress. She screams in German, begging unseen soldiers not to touch her, fighting a battle in her mind that the nurses can only watch in sorrow. Every hour that her temperature remains above 105 degrees brings her closer to permanent brain damage or complete organ failure. To understand the sheer terror in that small isolation room, we have to look at the dark numbers behind epidemic typhus during the war. The disease is spread entirely by infected body lice, which thrive in crowded, unsanitary conditions where thousands of men are packed together without the ability to wash. Once the bacteria enters the human bloodstream through a tiny louse bite, the mortality rate can climb as high as 60% if the patient is starved and untreated. The incubation period lasts for nearly 2 weeks, meaning a person can carry the death sentence across oceans before feeling a single symptom. A fever of 106 degrees is the critical threshold, the exact point where the human body simply begins to shut down under its own heat. In the camps of Europe, typhus wiped out entire populations, making it an enemy just as deadly as the artillery shells falling outside. The rash that covers the body is caused by small blood vessels literally bursting beneath the skin due to the aggressive infection. For the American doctors looking at Ilara, those pink spots and that boiling temperature mean they are fighting a war against an invisible army that has already breached the gates. We are now stepping back from the grim statistics of the disease and returning to the bedside in the isolation room. Outside the door, a completely different kind of battle is brewing over what to do with her. While the nurses fight to keep Ilara's temperature down, the camp commander arrives at the hospital to see the impossible situation for himself. He stands in the doorway of the isolation ward, staring in disbelief at the young girl shivering on the military cot. He immediately demands answers from the doctor, asking how his guards could have processed a female prisoner without noticing. The doctor points out that when a human being is covered in mud, starved to the bone, and wearing a baggy uniform, gender becomes completely invisible. The commander realizes the massive security and public relations disaster he now has on his hands. Returning her to the general population of the men's camp is completely out of the question, both for her safety and for military protocol. At the same time, she cannot simply be released into the United States because she was captured carrying a weapon in a combat zone. The commander argues that she must be transferred to a high-security military prison for interrogation once she wakes up. The doctor furiously pushes back, stating that the girl is not a spy, but simply a terrified teenager who wore a disguise to avoid being assaulted or killed. The argument ends in a tense standoff, with the commander agreeing to wait until the fever breaks before making an official report to Washington. As the sun sets over the prisoner of war camp, the heat inside the isolation room remains stifling, smelling faintly of rubbing alcohol and sickness. Alara's condition deteriorates further as the bacteria attacks her central nervous system, causing violent tremors that shake the small wooden cot. The doctor stays by her side, periodically listening to her heart, which is racing at a terrifying speed just to keep her blood moving. He knows that if her pulse drops suddenly, it means her heart muscle is failing under the immense strain of the infection. The nurses take turns wiping her face with cold cloths, watching the dark pink rash spread ominously down her arms and legs. Around midnight, Alara suddenly stops thrashing and goes perfectly still, her breathing becoming dangerously shallow. This is the crisis point of typhus, the moment where the body either finds the strength to fight back or quietly surrenders to the disease. The doctor injects her with a stimulant to keep her heart pumping, a desperate measure to buy her immune system just a little more time. In her delirium, she stops shouting about the war and begins to whisper quietly, calling out for a mother she has not seen in over a year. The American staff, who only hours ago viewed the arriving prisoners as a faceless enemy mass, find themselves desperately rooting for this single broken girl. Just before dawn, the tense silence in the room is broken by the sound of a deep, shuddering gasp from the cot. The doctor quickly steps forward, placing his hand against Alara's forehead, expecting to feel the terrifying, dry heat that has defined the last 12 hours. Instead, his skin comes away slick with heavy sweat, and the unnatural stiffness in her neck seems to have vanished. He slides the glass thermometer back under her tongue, his own heart racing as he waits for the long minutes to pass. When he checks the mercury this time, the reading has dropped from 106 to a much safer 102 degrees. The massive sweat is the physical sign that her immune system has finally turned the tide and broken the back of the infection. Alara slowly opens her eyes, the wild panic of delirium replaced by deep, hollow exhaustion and extreme confusion. She looks at the white ceiling, the unfamiliar faces of the American nurses, and then down at her own chest, realizing that her bindings are gone. Panic flares in her eyes as she tries to pull the thin sheet up to her chin, convinced that she is about to be dragged out and punished. The doctor holds his hands up slowly, speaking in soft, broken German, telling her that she is safe, and the secret is entirely secure in this room. Over the next 3 days, Alara drifts in and out of a deep, healing sleep, her body slowly repairing the massive damage caused by the fever. The rash begins to fade into light brown bruises, and her breathing returns to a normal, steady rhythm. When she is finally awake enough to speak, the doctor sits beside her with the interpreter to piece together her incredible journey. She tells them about the ruined barn, the dead soldier, and the absolute terror of marching alongside men who would have turned on her in an instant. The American nurses listen in stunned silence, realizing the immense psychological toll of hiding your true self every single minute of the day. For Alara, the hardest part of waking up is accepting that her long, terrifying performance is finally over. She no longer has to deepen her voice, hunch her shoulders, or hide in the shadows when the other prisoners are washing. One afternoon, a nurse walks into the isolation room carrying a neatly folded stack of clothing acquired from the local town. It is not a prison uniform, but a simple, cotton dress and a pair of soft shoes. When Alara touches the fabric, she begins to cry silently, the tears washing away the last invisible remnants of the mud and grease she used to hide her face. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. Alara's survival brings a new, very different kind of threat into the quiet isolation room. Word of a disguised female prisoner reaches the regional military command, and they are not entirely convinced by the story of an innocent civilian. An American military intelligence officer arrives at the camp, carrying a leather briefcase and a firm belief that she might be a spy. He sets up a chair beside her cot, bringing along a strict translator to question her about her true motives. The officer demands to know if she was trained by the secret police, or if her mission was to gather information on the United States transport networks. Alara is still incredibly weak, her voice barely more than a whisper as she answers the relentless barrage of questions. She describes the ruined barn, the dead soldier she took the uniform from, and the absolute chaos of the collapsing front lines. She explains that a teenage girl running alone through a defeated army would not have survived the week, let alone the ocean crossing. The doctor stands in the corner of the room, frequently interrupting the interrogation to remind the officer that his patient nearly died of typhus just days ago. Slowly, the intelligence officer realizes that her terrified, consistent answers are not the practiced lies of a trained saboteur, and he finally accepts that her only mission was to stay alive. The camp commander is eventually forced to resolve the impossible situation of his accidental female prisoner. After reading the doctor's notes and the intelligence officer's final report, he realizes that prosecuting her as an enemy soldier would be a cruel and pointless exercise. The military bureaucracy grinds its gears, trying to figure out how to classify a girl who officially does not exist in their system. Eventually, a decision comes down from higher command to quietly transfer her to a secure, comfortable holding facility designed for civilian internees. The paperwork is drafted in a way that minimizes the camp's embarrassment while ensuring Alara receives proper care. Before she leaves the prisoner of war camp, the medical staff gather outside the isolation room to say goodbye. The doctor who cut open her uniform hands her a small bag of personal items and wishes her luck in her new life. She steps out of the hospital building wearing the simple cotton dress, her short hair finally starting to grow out into soft waves. For the first time since she left the ruined city in Germany, she walks with her head held high, no longer trying to be invisible. She climbs into the back of an American staff car, leaving the barbed wire and the thousands of male prisoners far behind her. When Alara finally drives away from the prisoner of war camp, she leaves behind a story that the medical staff will never forget. The medical charts showing her 106-degree fever are filed away, becoming a quiet legend among the doctors who witnessed it. She survives the remainder of the war in relative comfort, reading books and slowly recovering the weight that the typhus and the marching stole from her. When the war officially ends, she is repatriated to Germany, joining thousands of others in the difficult task of finding lost family members in the rubble. Her survival is a testament to the sheer, desperate willpower of ordinary people caught in the meat grinder of a global war. The disguise that brought her to the brink of a terrible death was the exact same thing that saved her from the horrors of the battlefield. If she had not put on that dead boy's uniform, she might never have made it to the American lines to surrender.